And we are here, Mr. Poelacta, so please proceed.
Yeah. There we are. I'm looking. Yep. I see the candidate also. Welcome to the session. Hereby, I open this academic ceremony in which Maria Antonieta Collazos Ortiz will defend her academic thesis on the political economy of resource rents distribution, insights from a developing and decentralized country. May I invite you to present the summary of your study and the conclusions of your thesis. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Good morning, good afternoon. I'm here to defend my dissertation on the political economy of resource rents distribution, insights from a developing and decentralized country. My name is Maria Antonieta Collazos Ortiz. The motivation and background for this dissertation is born from the acknowledgement of uneven development, not only across nations, but among jurisdictions within those nations, where the same government interventions yield diverse outcomes for subnational units, compromising their development. One of the causes for that uneven development can be traced back to the principles governing the allocation of resources and expenditures between the different levels of governments, what we know as fiscal federalism. Fiscal federalism literature has two mainstreams. The first generation, which has a normative approach, where benign social planners are in charge of allocation of resources and expenditures in seek of efficiency and equality. However, as theory didn't match the evidence, the second generation arose with a more positive approach, where these social planners are seen as utility-maximizing public agents that respond to fiscal and political incentives of fiscal federalism interventions. Their responses have led to unintended and sometimes undesired outcomes, and this prompts new fiscal changes that further incentives and for actors, and also further unintended outcomes for other locals or for other levels of government. So decentralization is recognized as an ongoing process where institutional dynamic responses reveal the real effects of fiscal decentralization. However, limited attention has been given to the incentives and the consequences of these continuous institutional redesigns in resource distribution, fundamentally to whether and how institutional redesign can improve or worsen fiscal federalism outcomes. In addition, as this thesis is concerned with the redistribution of natural resource rents, it highlights the importance of fiscal federalism's second generation literature to address the decentralization of resource rents as a matter of fiscal federalism. We need to identify its political determinants and see what light they can provide about the transmission mechanisms of the course. So this dissertation touches two main streams of literature. First, the second generation of fiscal federalism, which recognizing its dynamism, and then the resource course literature seen through the lens of fiscal federalism. This led us to the main research question: how institutional redesign can exacerbate the political incentives behind resource rents distribution and the fiscal responses of subnational governments. And for that, I have included three sub-questions. The first one, if the impact of party alignment on revenue distribution depends or not on the intergovernmental transfer policy. The second one, if local investment in human capital can be jeopardized by redistributive policy changes, the political budget cycle, and resource rents. And finally, if local administrative efficiency can limit or not the substitution effect caused by intergovernmental resources and the redistribution. The strongest common thread across these three chapters is the dynamism of fiscal federalism and its impact on the efficiency with which scarce resources are actually distributed and used. The context is Colombia, which is a developing and highly decentralized country that underwent an intergovernmental redistribution of resources rents in 2012. Before 2012, municipalities where natural resources were produced, they received 80% of royalty revenue collected by the national government that was directly transferred to them by production levels. Non-producers, on the other hand, competed for 8% of that royalty collected via regional projects. After 2012, producers' shares was reduced to 10% of royalty revenue of the total royalty revenue that was collected by the national government, and this was allocated to them by production level. However, in order to really access those resources, they had to compete via submission and approval of projects. So producers not only saw their share reduced, but they also lost direct access to the resources, facing clear incentives to adopt fiscal changes to compensate for those lost funds. Non-producers, on the other hand, were now to compete for 10% of royalty revenue, which was allocated to them by poverty and population criteria, but they also had to submit projects. So fundamentally, the country transition from this strict resource distribution based on production to something more equitable, a more equitable distribution through a process of project submission and approval. The reform then becomes a unique opportunity to test if the extent to which policy design in resource distribution counteracts or not the use of resources to buy political support, to test if the impact of resource rents on PBCs in the context of intergovernmental redistribution, and finally, the extent to which local administrative efficiency can limit the substitution effect caused by royalty revenue. The data is 1,101 municipalities in Colombia over the period 2002 to 2017. 289 are producers and 812 are non-producers. The first research sub-question, whether the impact of party alignment on revenue distribution depends or not on the transfer policy, locates us into the literature about intergovernmental grants distribution, where we find that resources are distributed based on political interest. Here we find more for federal countries that political alignment across government levels does result in higher transfers. Literature has also devoted some time to debate about the conditions under which party alignment distorts efficient transfer distribution, for example, margin of victory or the voter's location. However, limited attention has been given to the regulatory framework of intergovernmental transfers as a condition that can matter for parties' alignment impact on royalty revenue distribution. So this brings us then to our hypothesis to answer this research sub-question. The first one is that we expect a positive and larger impact of party congruence between the mayor and the president on receiving royalty revenue after the policy of 2012. We assume that discretion was more feasible after the policy because it made all municipalities eligible for receiving grants, opening the possibility of the ruling party of the president to buy votes by directing the distribution of grants. The second hypothesis has to do with the fact that we expect this positive impact to be stronger in non-producers and to hold regardless of mayor's voucher. It will be stronger for non-producers because, as opposed to producers, non-producers were not constitutionally entitled to resource rents, and this makes them vulnerable to political bias. In addition, we expect this impact to hold over mayor's voucher because we are dealing here in Colombia with an unstable multi-party context, where the ruling party is likely to be less willing to risk its core electoral support, so it's going to deliver benefits primarily towards non-producers that are already providing a strong support, regardless of mayor's voucher. What do we find? We find that yes, fiscal institutions, in this case the regulatory framework of transfers, can be levered by agents to increase the influence of party alignment on resource distribution, fundamentally turning resources into bargaining chips for political support. That we also find that the alignment effect, yes, it is particularly relevant for non-producers without previous legal access to royalties as shown in the graph of the left, which made them more vulnerable to political bias. So the regulatory framework is key in determining whether and when party alignment can distort efficient distribution of transfers, and this is relevant for resource-rich developing countries that are trying to avoid the paradox of the plenty. In addition, we also find support for the core borders model in this politically fragmented landscape, as loyal non-producer supporters were rewarded regardless of their voucher. The second research sub-question, if local investment in human capital can be jeopardized by redistributive policy changes, the political budget cycle, and resource rents, locate us into the literature of political budget cycles where politicians tend to adopt expansionary fiscal policies before elections to advance their careers. We also find authors such as Robinson et al. That indicate that resource rents distribution can influence election outcomes via patronage. However, there are few studies on PBCs, the resource rents at the subnational level, so we don't really know if rents fuel or not local PBCs. In addition, few studies have been there on the resource cores from an intergovernmental perspective. One exception might be Hervasoni, who indicates that revenue sharing rules can weaken checks and balances, causing subnational democratic variations. However, no study has explored the impact of intergovernmental redistribution on public investment and in the presence of resource rents. To tackle down this sub-question, then, we established 4 hypotheses. The first one is that higher rents lead to higher investment, especially in health and education, and we took these sectors because they were visible sectors. The second one is that municipalities were more likely to increase their health and education investment before elections, which coincides with PVC theory. The third one is that the electoral cycle effects are going to be stronger in resource-rich municipalities because they could easily direct those rents towards these sectors via development plans or projects. And finally, resource-rich municipalities' investment decisions on health and education became less influenced by resource revenue after the policy, because as the policy actually reduced the share of the producers, then they lost this possibility of use these funds to fund electoral transfers towards visible sectors. We do find that municipalities do invest in health and education according to the resource rents that they receive, and that investment increases before elections and peaks 2 years before. So rents allow for fiscal manipulation even beyond the election year, becoming a mechanism to spread the PVCs and the cores. We also found that the PVC is stronger in resource-rich municipalities. However, because these rents are actually fostering higher levels of human capital investment in health and education beyond election years, they might counteract some of the negative consequences of the course. Finally, we do find that the policy reform made municipal investment decisions less reliant on resource rents, especially for producers and in education. However, there is this dilemma that these institutional changes that foster responsible fiscal behavior and that mitigated the impact of PVC actually restricted human capital investment, which is key for development. The last research question, if local administrative efficiency can limit the substitution effect caused by intergovernmental resources, locate us into the literature of the resource course that is dedicated to the substitution effect, where taxation is replaced by natural resource rents, instead of using those rents actually to advance long-term economic growth. Here, mixed findings have been found nationally, locally, and even in Colombia. So this makes us wonder under which conditions do governments actually substitute tax revenue with royalty revenue. Furthermore, it makes us wonder if these findings can be partly explained by differences in administrative efficiency between the different subnational jurisdictions. This led us to the importance of institutional quality to explain the extent to which subnational jurisdictions are subject to a natural resource course. We established 4 hypotheses to answer the question. The first one is whether a substitution effect actually took place. The second one, if those that are more efficient actually can collect more property tax revenue. The third one, if after 2012, producers collected more tax revenue compared to non-producers as they saw their share reduce and they lost direct access to resources. And finally, if after 2012, producers with more efficient administrations collected more tax revenue compared with less efficient producers. Results indicates that yes, producers did increase their fiscal effort after 2012, especially due to the less royalty revenue available to them, and especially those with higher administrative efficiency. This implies that there is a modifying role for administrative efficiency because subnational governments, when they are faced with a reduction in resources, can adapt and increase their revenue collection only if they possess sufficient administrative efficiency. So this administrative efficiency at the municipal level shapes fiscal effort adjustments, but also it helps to explain why intergovernmental transfers are not always associated with lower subnational fiscal efforts in the literature. It helps to explain a country's ability to avoid a substitution effect from intergovernmental grants. And of course, it helps to explain the susceptibility of subnational governments to a natural resource course. My dissertation has 4 main conclusions. The first one is that the crafting of intergovernmental transfers of these rules determines whether fiscal federalism compromises intended outcomes or contributes to development. You can move from strict rules to something more equitable, but this crafting is likely to introduce new inefficiency. If political objectives are incorporated, they are likely to distort resource distribution with potential effects in mitigating the curse. This speaks to the underlying mechanisms that link the political economy of grants with the resource course. In addition, when we try to foster responsible subnational fiscal behavior by crafting institutions, then we may end up constraining key investment for long-term development. The second conclusion is that institutional reforms on resource distribution inform about the mechanisms that lead precisely to that inefficient resource distribution and to suboptimal local management. Reforms are likely to enhance mechanisms that foster political aims because they allow for political considerations such as party alignment and PVCs, and for the heterogeneous responses of all different levels of government to interfere on the design to the implementation of the reform, regardless of the resources origin. But also, reforms may unveil means to counter political resource misuse, for example, via enhanced local administrative efficiencies. The third conclusion of my dissertation has to do with the fact that institutional crafting has unintended repercussions for subnational autonomy. When it's centrally driven, it's going to be designed with political aims in mind, and it's going to ignore the challenges that it poses to subnational autonomy, for example, the ability of subnational jurisdictions to generate or to access resources. It might also undermine the agreements on resources and responsibilities between the different levels of governments, and if it touches access to resources or competences, then it's going to jeopardize fiscal decentralization as we know it. The subnational units are going to lose the authority and the autonomy in the provisions of goods and services, and this is going to challenge the stability of their institutions. So when institutional crafting does not safeguard subnational autonomy, responsible fiscal management cannot be demanded from subnational jurisdictions, and this hampers fiscal federalism as a tool for development. The last conclusion stems from resource rents decentralization, because the distribution of these rents adds challenges to the fiscal federalism management and exacerbates the spread of the course, especially in developing context. By examining the decentralization of these resources, we tried to move from the conventional focus on the rents effects to delve into the political determinants that govern the distribution of those rents. And this provided some clarity about the underlying transmission mechanisms of the course. First, we recognize intergovernmental revenue sharing rules as a significant determinant of the inefficient distribution of rents. It can be because of strict rules that only reward production, or because it includes higher government level goals. These rules have an explanatory power of the course that is beyond subnational control. Second, intergovernmental redistribution of rents has a significant impact on public investment and on the relationship with subnational PVCs. PVCs and the course we saw propagate via transfers funded by royalties, and fiscal institutions can potentially mitigate these PVCs induced by rents, but there are always going to be unintended outcomes, as we already saw. Finally, by looking at the redistribution of resource rents, we raise the significance of institutional quality, or we raise the significance of that quality, specifically administrative efficiency, in explaining and countering subnational exposure to the course. Thank you.
Thank you for your presentation. The opposition will be opened by Professor Dr. Pierre Monen, who was the chair of the assessment committee. And Professor Monen is Emerite Professor of Econometrics of Technical Change at UNU Merit at this university. The floor goes to Professor Monen.
Dear candidate, let me congratulate you. This is an interesting topic of research, to look at the institutional aspect and how the institutions can change some of the problems of fiscal federalism. I would like to ask you a question concerning Chapter 3, namely the effect of proximity to an election on the investments on education and health. And let me, for instance, start with figure 3.2, 3.2a or 3.2b. I would have expected that the closer you get to an election, date of the election, the higher would be the effect of investment on be it education, be it health. So the politicians will try to increase these investments the closer we get to the election time to gain votes for the election. Now, what we see is the opposite, at least as the way I understand it. So the further we are away, 1, 2, 3 years, the higher is the investment in health and education. Why is that the case?
Highly esteemed opponent, thank you very much for your question. I think that in order to answer that question, we can move forward to the GMM estimation results, where we actually control for indigeneity. And then we can see that, yes, it kind of gets farther away from the election year, the investment, because there are several things that have to deal mainly with the context. The first one is that the resources that we're looking at that are fundamentally used for investment projects. And these investment projects usually take time to materialize, especially if we are in a developing context. So if you want to see the result of the project, you will need to start investing years before the time of the election if you want to get, for example, re-elected, or if you want your party to be re-elected. So you're likely to start investing not on the year of the election, probably not in the previous one, probably 2 years before, in order for those investment projects to be finished by the time of the election. That is one of the main reasons, as these resources were fundamentally used only for that type of investment projects, then you have to give them time to materialize. Mm-hmm. I think the second reason why this happens, and this is actually backed up by Bonnet et al. In 2020, is the cyclical form. You see it also because once the person is elected, the mayor is elected, he has 1 year to get his local development project approved by the council. So he says, or Bonnet states, that fundamentally what happens there is the first year you're not going to see the increase in the investment, but you're going to see it on the second year, right? Mm-hmm. Where the resources are actually going to move. So that's fundamentally. And the third reason that you're going to see during the election year, we have something that is called the Ley de Garantías, which prohibits mayors and anyone in the public sector to actually get into contracts 4 months before elections. So that actually kind of reduces a little bit the impact during the election year.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so this is, I think, a good explanation. So there are adjustment costs or delays in having the effects on the investment manifest in terms of output, I guess, in terms of. But what would be actually the output of that investment? Because if you make an investment, say, in a hospital for health, it's at the time where you make the investment that it will become visible. Now, you are saying that the effect of that investment will only materialize, say, 2 years later, but it would materialize in terms of health of the population or something like that. But what is important is, in terms of attracting the votes for the election, is actually the manifestation, the effort of increasing the investment. So is it really the output that counts or the input into that process?
Highly esteemed opponent, thank you very much for your question. I think that what matters here is not so much the results on health, because you're going to see them in the long term, and I think people associate that, but because these are very visible sectors, and this is why we focus also on them, you can see the transfers of resources on those investments in 2 years. So I think what is important here is that they actually deliver the projects, that it doesn't become what they call a white elephant, that it doesn't finish, but then that is actually finished within your terms, that is going to speak of you and of your party. So that's why I believe that the investment in those projects begins with 2 years, so they can at least guarantee that they are getting the closest possible to finishing that project.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so the adjustment cost in terms of doing the investment itself. Okay, then another question a bit related to this is, if I look at figure 3.3a and 3.3b, So the marginal effect of royalty revenue, there is not a significant effect in terms of the marginal effect of royalty revenue on health investment before and after the policy change, but there is in terms of education investment. Why? What is the interpretation of this in your view?
Okay, highly esteemed opponent, thank you very much for this comment. I thought about it too before, and what I was actually able to gather about this, why do we find this change in education, but we did not find it on health, is fundamentally when I was looking at, and that is actually found also by Bonet, that the health investment increased since 2008. And it keep on going after the reform. And this was, in general terms, backed up by the fact that health became a priority for the government at that moment. And when I say a priority, it meant that it says to all municipalities that the population had to have a 100% health coverage, especially those from the subsidized regime, which means that they are the poorer that cannot afford to pay for health. They had to have 100% coverage. So I think it was a push from the national government towards that sector, and that because the push began before the reform, when the reform came in, then it was a chance to actually let more projects towards investment in health. And then I think that's what the data is trying to say to us, fundamentally, that it was because of that push.
Okay.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you very much.
Thank you. The opposition will be continued by Professor Dr. Kent Eaton, who was also a member of the assessment committee and who is a distinguished professor of politics at University College of Santa Cruz. The floor goes to Professor Eaton.
Thank you. And thank you, Maria Antonieta, for such an interesting thesis. I learned so much from this thesis, and I'm excited to see you publish these chapters as articles, because I see a lot of potential here. And I think you've uncovered some really interesting and very surprising findings, and particularly somebody who studies Colombia, including the argument you just talked about, where in chapter 3, you show that political business cycles actually lead to investments, at least in health, if not education, which is a huge challenge to the resource curse literature. So most of that literature says that indeed decentralization is just replicating the resource curse at the subnational level. Hervasoni, you mentioned, also Javier Arellano Yaguas, he's showing the same thing in Peru. And so I think that's a quite interesting finding, that in fact political business cycles are leading to rather positive investments in health and education. And that's a major challenge too. And I would frame it in that way as you published, chapter 3 as an article. But I wanted to ask you about and kind of shift to chapter 2, a question about chapter 2, and the thing that I found so surprising in chapter 2, which has to do with the National Planning Department. So the Departamento Nacional de Planeación, the DNP, in Colombia and in the literature on Colombia, the DNP is always seen as this highly competent, highly technocratic, politically insulated agency within the bureaucracy, this kind of island of competence and expertise, full of people with PhDs in economics who apply, their technocratic criteria. And indeed, the 2012 reform was justified, right? Santos, the president, justified it as something that would ensure that these monies were spent on high quality projects and not white elephants, right? And so that's kind of the way that the DNP is understood in Colombia. And again, in the literature, all the way back to kind of Albert Hirschman, they're the heroes of the story of Colombia. And so the thing that is so surprising about your thesis is that it suggests otherwise, that the DNP in your argument is really what enables the national government and the party in control of the national government to ensure that the funds through the OCAD are indeed sent to those municipalities governed by the same party to reward supporters. And so it's a completely different vision, really, of the DNP, a much more negative one. It's a much more critical one, and it's quite interesting to me. And so I'm wondering, because your argument really hinges on the fact that the representatives of the DNP are systematically imposing partisan and not technocratic criteria. And so I'm wondering if you could talk more about, this is one of the most surprising things in the thesis. Is it that its reputation for kind of Weberian efficiency is dated, or it's not true in this particular program? Because it's something that would not be surprising if it was the health ministry or the transport ministry, but it's the DNP. And so could you talk more about, was that surprising to you? How do you understand the role, the very, very negative role that it's playing in a partisan way?
Highly esteemed opponent, thank you very much for this question and this comment. I think I can elaborate a little bit also because I actually work for DNP too. So it's quite interesting to that you bring it up. Yes, it is seen as this high quality part of the executive branch, but it's still a part of the executive branch. That's the first thing that I would say. The second thing that I would say is that it was not really pushed by DNP, the reform. It was actually backed up, but the person that pushed it the most was, oh my goodness, Juan Carlos Echeverri, who was actually, I think, a ministry. And he was in charge, and he was the one that said that the jam had to be spread over the whole coast about the royalties. And he continuously say that in order, obviously backing up this with information regarding how the royalties went only to these departments with very few population and so on. When we think about DNP imposing something more technocratic than something more manipulated by the executive, what I think is when Santos government came in, it was known as the cocktail government because everybody was drinking cocktails and everybody was knowing each other. And I think that it started to lose a little bit of technocracy, even in DNP. Anyway, the director of DNP and, for example, the director of the financial directorate inside DNP are also nominated by the national government. That's the first thing. The second thing is that you have a parallel account in terms of the people. You have people that are actually public servants and do careers, and then you have those as me that have a contract. It doesn't mean that everybody that gets a contract is because or whatever, but in that sense, some of the people that is contracted by DNP in this parallel, how you said that, nomina, right? In this parallel where you do have all the human resources, actually, some of them are very qualified. Some of them started to come because they were friends of the friends. And this is not the first time that this happens inside DNP. But what happened with the reform is that it was so cumbersome inside DNP because they had to go to all the 900 OCADs in the municipalities to get the projects approved. And the public servants say, no, I'm not going to do that. I have my job here. I'm going to do it here. And they had this string. They were more strong in saying, I'm not going to do it. So it was moved towards the consultants fundamentally. And the consultants' jobs depended fundamentally on the national government. That's what I think it permeated, the sense of, yeah, you go there, but then because of that municipality, you have to tell them that maybe not because they're not with us, and re-election was coming up. That was a true fact. Santos was thinking about it, and I think Juan Carlos backed it up because they needed a way to actually ensure they have the political capital to assure they were going to win a re-election. I think that's the main point. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
I think that's fascinating. Yeah. Should I follow up?
Well, let's look if we get into a second round first. It would be nice to now have Dr. Habers, also member of the assessment committee, to continue the opposition. She's an associate professor of political science at the University of Amsterdam. And the floor now goes to Dr. Habers.
Yes. Dear candidates, let me also start by congratulating you on a job well done. So this is a very interesting manuscript. It's empirically rich. The empirical analysis is very competently executed, and I learned a lot from it. So it's clearly theoretically very firmly rooted in the literature on fiscal federalism. And it also tells us a lot about what happened in Colombia in the course of this reform that you examine closely. And that's the policy change that's at the heart of your dissertation. My question is about the implications of your findings, and specifically about the generalizability of your findings beyond the case of Colombia. So you explain in the introduction of your dissertation that you opt for a within-case analysis. So you compare municipalities within one country to ensure internal validity. And overall, the dissertation generally treats Colombia as just a typical case of a decentralized developing country. But in many ways, Colombia is also different from other countries in that category. And I can think of two ways that strike me as particularly important. So first, it has a comparatively long track record of democratic governance compared to other developing decentralized countries. And then secondly, there's also the presence of armed actors within the territory. And previous research has shown that sometimes these armed actors have captured municipal governments and have pressured them to expend resources or to use resources in a certain way. So what I would like to ask you is what implications this has for the external validity of your findings. What can we learn from this case beyond Colombia? And is there anything specifically Colombian in your story in a way? Is there anything specific about Colombia that might impact whether these findings travel to other cases or not?
Esteemed opponent, thank you very much for your comments and your questions. I'll try to tackle them down as much as I can. I think, well, when you have these type of studies, in any case, you try to make it as much out of external validity as you can, but obviously there are things that are going to remain being of the case fundamentally, and that's something that we have to recognize up to some point. Now, when we speak of the conflict, for example, in Colombia, and this is something that made me thought a lot, because when you bring conflict, then it's going to make up everything more confusing probably in the study. But yeah, Colombia has this extended civil conflict that has been going on since the 50s, and we are very conflict nation from before that. But I think that in this particular case, the impact of that conflict on the study's external validity remains limited in the sense that the analysis covered 2002 to 2017. And this is a period that has been marked by a substantial decline in conflict intensity and scope, following the years from 1996 to 2002. And this is said by Restrepo et al., who is actually a professor here in Javeriana that is always dealing with these topics in conflict. What we see is that from 1996 to 2002, you are going to see a rise in conflict, probably because, as stated by Eaton in 2006, it was favored by these empowered groups by the decentralization reforms that were taken into account. First, we did this political decentralization, and then we did the fiscal and administrative, and this began in the 80s and continued with the 1991 Constitution. So fundamentally, what it did is that it brought all these illegal groups to the urban areas of the municipalities. Now, as you know, from 2002 until 2010, we had President Mr. Uribe, who was very strong in terms of security policy. And what he did was he pushed back the conflict back to the rural area. This precisely ends up coinciding with the period that we have within time. Also, we have some authors that says that even in its most severe phases, the conflict did not fundamentally disrupt the nation's short-term economic and macroeconomic functions. And the guerrilla actions didn't pose a limited threat to the established order. When we look in terms, for example, of some references that can be found before the 2002, the years before, where the conflict was really, really strong, what we see is that just in a handful of localities, municipal elections were actually not held. And in some of them, a few of them, just military measures were imposed in order, in a temporary basis, just to put some order. So what I'm trying to say here is that probably the time frame that we use is less impacted by that conflict. So that limits the impact of the conflict on the study's external validity, fundamentally.
All right, then let me just quickly follow up and ask about the other factor that makes Colombia somewhat different. So it has a stronger track record of electoral democracy than other developing countries. Do you think that matters, for instance, because parties are more established or they have a longer history, or are there other factors that you think might impact how the political incentives that you examine play out?
I think inside the democratic version of the governance, yeah, we're democratic in many senses, but I think that this democracy was pushed more, because of the 1991 Constitution that moved us from this two-party system, where there was always the liberals and the conservatives, and they were the ones that were ruling always inside the country, regionally, and so on. However, with the Constitution, we achieved this transition to this multi-party system where everybody got a place, but this actually played out not so well because we got a numerous weak candidate-based parties that actually lack supporters' discipline. And this was actually reformed right before the 2003 election, where they actually started to say, okay, if you're going to form a party, then you have to have at least this support and so on. They started to put some limits on this. They also spoke of you couldn't be in two parties at the same time and so on. So when we have a multi-party or fragmented political landscape, then the presidential coalitions are going to be the center of political alignment. And that's going to bring you to power fundamentally. So in that sense, yes, we're democratic, but this has also played in order to all these coalitions to form. One example is, for example, Mr. Uribe, who was a formerly liberal dissident. And when he launched when he was first launched as a candidate back in 2002, he made his own party. It was First Colombia Movement. And then it welcomed support not from the liberals, but from the conservatives and independents. So it was the other side of what he was being part before. And then in the second turn, he launched himself with a coalition that included the National U, the U that was created by Santos, the Conservative Party, and the Radical Change Party. And then that was inherited by Santos too. And this actually helped the establishment to continue to be in follow-up with this. And then you see it again with Duque. So we really kind of, besides having, this multi-party system, we still go between liberals and conservatives, and there's not that much change. I think the biggest change we're having it right now with Presidente Petro, which is a different side of the political landscape.
Good, thank you. The opposition will be continued by the fourth member of the assessment committee, and that's Dr. Kai Thompson. Dr. Thompson is Associate Professor of Economics at this university, Maastricht University. The floor goes to Dr. Thompson.
Thank you very much. And my apologies, I've done everything I can to keep my internet working, and it still might fail me, in which case I suggest that we switch the order of us. But for now, it works. Dear candidate, I found your thesis very interesting. It's quite closely related to my own interests, and I have learned a lot from reading the thesis. I believe your results, and I think they offer very interesting insights and potentially conclusions for policy design and institutional design. I was intrigued in particular by statements in chapter 3 about the possible positive impacts of political budget cycles, or at least investments that are done in the context of political budget cycles, due to an overall increase in health and education investments in particular. As far as I know, this is really the first paper or chapter that I have seen that emphasizes that aspect, typically portrayed as negative. I would like to know whether you can elaborate on this. In particular, does anything in your research or in your thinking based on your research offer us any guidance regarding how we could potentially keep the positive aspects while limiting the downsides? Are there, for instance, institutional reforms that could simultaneously keep the higher investments in health and education, but perhaps reduce the political cyclicality? Or should we maybe think of the political cyclicality simply as a price we might have to pay for higher investments in things that are really sensible and productive in the long run? That is my first question.
Esteemed opponent, thank you very much for your questions. I think that the reason when you elaborate saying that, yeah, the positive impact of PBCs on investment in health and education, especially coming from the resource rents, because we see this in the resource course literature that says that usually local governments are going to end up with inferior industrial economies or with lower local government revenues, and then you're going to find lower public investment. And precisely, well, in health and in education. There are two things that actually play there. I think the first one is you have a lot of resources as a producer municipality, and especially they did before the reform. And this influences the fact, this is also influenced by the fact that if we go back to before the reform, producers that receive 80% of the bulk of the royalties were actually had to meet these social targets, such as infant mortality, coverage in education, in basic education. And if they didn't meet some targets that were put by the national government, then 75% of the 80% that they received was to be sent towards projects in health, education, and water and sanitation. So that's the first impact that you are going probably to see. And this is why probably you see an increase in investment in health and education, even in those producers that are subject to the resource course. Obviously, they are going to use it more when they are close to elections, because it's a way to transfer fundamentally to the electorate money. No, if you do the project in health close to the neighborhood where you have support, and there is a way to obviously get more votes for the next election or for your party in the next election. So I think that's one of the reasons why we are contradictory to what is found in the literature. In addition, when you state that, how do we keep this impact that is positive because we have higher investment? What I believe there is, yes, we do have higher investment, but it never has translated into better outcomes. So I think that the effort here is not how much am I willing to pay as the price for this cyclicality of political budgets, but in reality, I think the policy has to be enforced towards what do we do with the resources, and that's where we always lack. It lacked in the previous way of the royalty system, and in the new system, it lacked, because the money got lost, because you never find the outcomes, because still we don't have health coverage in Guajira after years and years of pulling out coal. So this is what basically I think is more important than even thinking of the cyclicality of the political cyclicality of the political budget cycle.
Okay, thank you very much. That is very interesting. I could go on and ask more about that, but I have one other quick related question that I would also like to ask. So I'll switch to that. I think my second question is about the theoretical underpinnings. And at some point I developed a theoretical model that I ended up cutting out from political budget cycle work. It's not in any published work, but it still helped me tremendously to think through what the results actually meant. In your work, I sometimes struggle to know exactly what the findings really mean and imply, because I don't have such a theoretical model in the back of my head. I would like to know, I would like you to reason a little bit more around the theoretical underpinnings in order to help me here. And in particular, I would like you to discuss, if you had to write down a theoretical model and make assumptions about the objective function of the politicians and perhaps the behavior of the voters, but in particular of the relevant politicians here, what you would include in their objective function. And I'm asking in part because, if I understand it correctly, many of the relevant politicians at the local level here are term limited, which means that it's not so clear, unless you think of anointed successors or parties, why they would want to spend before elections, right? So could you elaborate a bit more on this, how you think of the political objective function of the politicians and exactly what you would include also in the voters' decision-making process?
Esteemed opponent, thank you very much for your questions. I hope I can answer that. I think that then in the objective function here, besides the fact, yes, they are term limited, but when we think about politics in Colombia, as I was previously mentioned, this is a fragmented landscape in terms of political, it's a politically fragmented landscape, which means that we have all these parties that are very opportunistic. That's the first thing that I would say. And that means that you just kind of get together with whoever is promising you the better, no? So now if I'm actually a mayor and I'm trying to spend before the electoral, they can see this investment project by the year of the election, right? Even if I'm not going to get elected, it means that my party might get elected. And it doesn't mean that I cannot rerun after the following term. I cannot run right in the immediate one, but I could do it in the next one, as it has happened, for example, in Antioquia, in certain municipalities. So in that sense, people remember that. You build the school here, you build the hospital here, maybe the water and sewage was done under this term. So then that creates some political capital if you again want to run in the future for the same post. In addition, because you have all these coalitions, then if you are already joined with the governors or maybe with the center, then it means that if you got good results, you're going to likely to end up with more maybe votes if you decided to launch yourself as a senator, for example. So I think all of these things are playing there to actually answer your questions regarding why would I see a PVC there. That's in the thinking of the candidate per se. On the side of the voters' decision, I think that this money is not supposed to be used for transfers directly to the voters, no, because it's supposed to be in these investment projects. But I think that when we observe how the monitoring of this royalty system has been, one of the answers, for example, is, oh, look, the project is accepted and everything. So who's going to implement it? Well, we only have one person that offered to do it. So then that is a little bit of, okay, so the people around it, the voters' decisions and the support maybe might end up for who are you ending up giving the contract to construct the little school or the hospital in that neighborhood. I think that also has to do with the voters' decisions on who to support or whom not. And that is included in that. That's what I would have to say.
Yeah, thank you very much. I would like to give the floor for continuing the opposition to Dr. Victor Ose-Cuatro, who is an urban governance specialist at the UNU-Merit of this university. The floor goes to Dr. Cuatro.
Thank you very much. And dear candidate, congratulations for this body of work on fiscal federalism. Decentralization has been promoted widely in developing countries and its utmost form devolution and associated fiscal autonomy and studied with respect to redistribution policies. And specifically for your case, the dimension on natural resources and royalty revenue distribution is very unique. Well done for this. Nonetheless, I have a few questions. One question, which is specifically related to your chapter 2, the results. So in chapter 2, you found that the policy change, which was mainly a redistribution policy, had implication for non-producers in a sense that it increased their royalty revenue. What I would like to ask is that, would you have expected anything different? Is there a possible scenario where the policy change could have led to no revenue increase for the non-producers?
Esteemed opponent, thank you very much for this question. I think what I was trying to conduct the flow of thinking regarding what had happened here, I actually didn't think it was going to be the other way. For example, that they could use it against producers, because in the case of producers, as I mentioned, they were constitutionally backed up. They were already making a scandal about the reform. It was hard on them. It was a political scandal, and they came over here all the way to Senate to say, I don't want this. We shouldn't not support this reform. So if there was going to be some inherence of the political alignment on the approval of those producers' projects that was going to generate a further scandal. And it was going to reduce the government trust that was needed for Santos to get reelected. So what I expected was if they were going to put discretion, it was going to be on the non-producer sides, because those non-producers were sold the idea that, oh, you're going to get access now to these lots of resources that you'd never had access before. But then if you really want the thing approved, or if you want the 200 millions that you never had before, then you need to be on the side of the president. And if you're not, then I'm going to treat you different. So that's kind of what I think. I didn't expect different in that sense. I think the government of Mr. President, Mr. Santos, was very towards that line of thought where they really needed and wanted the support from those type of municipalities where they could actually exert the political bias.
Thank you. This is very clear enough. My other question is related to the use of terminologies throughout the thesis. So I realized there was the interchangeable use of institutional change, policy change, and reforms. Do you consider these terminologies as the same in your operationalization?
I do think when we talk about institutional change that we are covering reforms and policies. That's how I see it. And especially if we're changing them. So this is an institutional change because you are imposing these rules to these subunits that actually don't have a lot of control over them.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you. This concludes the first round and gives us an opportunity for a very short, though, second round. And I would like to give the floor to Professor Dr. Kent Eaton again, because he's from further away than Maastricht University, as he's a member of the University College of Santa Cruz. The floor goes to Professor Eaton.
Great. Well, I really appreciated your answer to my question earlier, and I think that I would encourage you, as you develop Chapter 2 as an article, to dig into exactly the way that the contractors within the DNP were really the ones responsible for kind of doing the more political, so that's a very that was a very convincing answer. And so I think maybe one other question that I would have, and this would be about Chapter 4, the last kind of substantive chapter on the resource curse and efficiency. And so the question that I asked, back in October when I read the thesis, and the surprise that I had was just that you focus on efficiency rather than capacity. And so, because I think the resource curse literature fundamentally is arguing that resources undermine the ability of the state or the incentives of the state to develop capacity, because they can just, pull resources out of the ground, literally, and they don't need to build administrative capacity. And so all of that literature is really obsessed with capacity as the kind of the core concept. And instead, in your chapter, it's efficiency. And so I'm still curious about that. And it feels like, because I think you should also publish that chapter as an article, but I think a reviewer would likely say, why is she talking about efficiency and not capacity, given that that's the core concept within the resource curse literature? So maybe some further thoughts on that.
Highly esteemed opponent, thank you very much for your question. Yeah, there were, the article was published, and one of the comments at some point was about these two. We actually had two measures in the data. One was administrative capacity, and the other one was administrative efficiency in the original article. Now, when we think about the resource curse literature, you find all these measures about institutional quality. And because great part of the research literature focuses on cross-national studies, then you see things like the freedom of the media or the rule of law in the country, measures of corruption at the national level, and so on. When you look or dig into the subnational studies of institutional capacity, it becomes a little bit harder, especially when you deal with data constraints. However, there are some efforts, for example, in the case of Colombia, such as Oliveri and Perry in 2009, which actually try to measure some institutional quality by looking at the institutions associated with the protection of property rights, or things like the NGOs at the municipal level, or the number of candidates in the last election, and so on, which are valid measures of institutional quality, of course. Yet when we found the data, we were looking at it, then there was these two measures. the administrative capacity and the administrative efficiency. For both of them, results hold. But administrative capacity actually look at the inputs. You look, for example, how many of the people that work in the municipality had an undergraduate degree, or how many computers were there at the municipality, but it didn't say much more about it. So the other measures was administrative efficiency, which talk about how inputs in, for example, the investment or the classroom space or the investment in education was translated in number of people enrolled at the education, at the basic level of education. So this measure of administrative efficiency, which has into account the three distinct sectors, health, education, and water and sanitation, actually translate these inputs in these three sectors into outputs and gives a measure for the municipality. So it kind of spoke more of the efficiency with what inputs were used to obtain those results. So then we try to focus this there because we use it as a proxy. We say if they were good at using those inputs and translated it in outputs, maybe this could be a proxy. Think of the efficiency with which municipality can actually collect the taxes. That's why we use it. And these two concepts actually come closer, not to the resource course literature, but the public administration field, where you have capacity really separated from what it is efficiency.
Horas.
Thank you all very much. The hour has passed, which implies Maria Antonieta Collazos Ortiz, the time appointed for defending your thesis has passed, and the degree committee will now withdraw to discuss the quality of your thesis and the quality of your defense. I request that you and your company await the results of our deliberations and wait for our return. Maria Antonieta Collazos Ortiz, the degree committee here present online has assessed the quality of your thesis and the quality of your defense. And in view of its positive verdict and taking into account your previous qualifications, the degree committee has decided to grant you the degree of doctor. Professor Nielsen is authorized to confer upon you this academic distinction in accordance with Dutch university custom. And I invite your supervisor to now take the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Pro-Rector. Dear Maria, I will now read a formal text. Do you promise to work in accordance with the principles of scientific integrity at all times, to be careful and honest, transparent, independent, and responsible?
You're muted. Yeah, thank you.
By the authority vested in us by law and in conformity with the decision of the committee here present, I hereby confer upon you, Maria Antonieta Collazos Ortiz, the degree of doctor, and grant you all rights attached by custom and law. As evidence of this, I now present, virtually, but the beetle will, maybe. I now present you with degree certificate signed by the rector, the secretary, and the other members of the committee, and affixed with the official seal of the university.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Dear Maria, dear Dr. Collazos Ortiz, from the start of your PhD journey, we had agreed I would take a backbench in the supervisory team, which has been a very comfortable role, I must say, and I will return to that backbench in less than a minute. But before I give the floor to your supervisors who really worked very closely with you on the several chapters, I would like to take this opportunity to congratulate you with this amazing achievement. Thanks very much, and I will hand over to Arjen now.
Thank you very much.
Professor, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you. Dear Maria, congratulations. You have now a PhD degree, and that's truly an accomplishment. I would like to emphasize that in your case, this is truly an achievement to be proud of. Every PhD student experiences ups and downs, and I believe that among the most important character traits for PhD students to have are tenacity and determination. And I can surely guarantee that you have these character traits. You have managed to pursue and successfully complete a PhD project, while at the same time you also have a full-time job and you have a family that deserves attention. This meant often, if not most of the time, working in the evenings, weekends, and during holidays. On top of that, you've built a database with municipal and departmental level data that's assembled from various datasets from several ministries, as well as various kinds of political data, such as election results. The quality of the data is now very good, but it was a Herculean task to get to know what exactly was measured by several indicators and to fill in and complete missing cells. Thanks to your determination and tenacity, there's now a dataset that opens up an interesting research agenda on the politics of fiscal intergovernmental relations in Colombia. And I would like to congratulate you with this dataset, because this is also definitely an achievement on which you can be proud of. We have co-authored a paper that's now published in the journal Local Government Studies. I will not get into the details, but I would like to mention that I have not experienced any time before that it took no less than 4 rounds of revising and submitting to convince one particular reviewer of the quality of the research. Again, seeing through such a kind of peer review process requires tenacity and determination, and you certainly have those character traits. I would like to congratulate you again, and my last advice in my role as a supervisor is to say to enjoy yourself and to be proud of your marvelous achievements. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Shackle.
Floor goes to Dr. Wang Tong.
Thank you. Dear Maria, I still remember that when you were in the first year at John the Institute, Mindo invited me to join the proposal sessions and read your proposal, provide you some like feedback and so on. And I still remember that when I read your revised proposal, like you tried to address our feedbacks as if you're answering reverse command to try to like publish something. So I was very impressed, and then that's why when Mindo asked me whether I'm willing to co-supervise your thesis, I happily accepted. And then I thought that, okay, supervisions must be a very easy job because you're a very serious student. And then many years, let's say, passed, and I'm sure that the PhD journey is not particularly easy for you, especially in the last couple of years. I still remember that last year, February around this time, you were in Maastricht presenting your last paper to us, and you still had some doubts about, okay, how long the process is going to take until graduations. And then suddenly, in a matter of just like few months, everything happens. You submitted your thesis to assessment committee, having publications in impactful journals. Thesis got approved. I'm really happy to see that you finally make it to this date. You may have shaken your self-confidence these years, and that actually worries me a little bit because I know that you are a very good student given the first year's experience that I have with you. So I hope that you can remember this moment, restore your faith and confidence in yourself. You did excellent, fabulous in today's defense. You are actually a better person than who you think you are. So you are a doctor now, so congratulations.
Thank you very much, Dr. Hampton.
Thank you. Dear Dr. Collazos Ortiz, also on behalf of Maastricht University, I congratulate you, your family, friends, and your supervisors with the degree you have acquired. I would also like to thank the members of the Ruggie Committee for their contribution. It was a very interesting discussion, and I hereby will declare this ceremony ended after having given the members an opportunity to congratulate you also. But congratulations anyway.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Congratulations, Mrs. Collazos Ortiz.
Thank you, Dr. Mahan.
Congratulations. Well done. Felicidades.
Gracias, Dr. Eaton. Thank you very much for everything, Dr. Nielsen, Arjan, and Hampton.